Floating cities, they could soon become a reality as planners try to come up with innovative ways to battle the space crunch. And Singapore being an island surrounded by lots of sea, are we likely to see it happen right here?
Well, to get some answers, we're joined by Lim Soon Heng, founder, president of the Society of Floating Solutions. He's also a fellow at the Institute of Maritime Engineering, Science and Technology. Soon Heng, thank you very much for coming in. So, you know, the idea of a floating city now no longer sounds like science fiction. But, yeah, but the question is it safe? And what must be considered when we actually want to build a floating city?
All right. Well, considering if the floating city is going to be a very substantial value, then we have to do it with professionals, right? And that means involving people who are with knowledge of the principles of flotation, such as naval architects, right? And the whole process involves designs and the design verification, audit by professional organizations such as the Classification Society, like Lloyd's, ABS. They are all international, and their certification will ensure that you could get underwriters to underwrite the property.
So just to be clear, a floating city is nothing like reclaimed land, right? Because the process of reclaiming land is a completely different thing altogether. We're talking about sustainable sort of cities here. How sustainable would such an environment be?
Well, for a start, your structure, your floating structure is not going to be sitting in the sea, and you won't be requiring importing sand from wherever, you know, like Vietnam or Indonesia. So you won't be disabling the ecosystem of those countries, and that's utterly important, because damage to the ecology of coastal cities is morally unacceptable.
So how feasible is it to actually implement a floating city in Singapore then?
It is very feasible because we have all the skill sets in Singapore. You know, we have been building oil rigs and stuff like that, and the shipyards are all here. All the supporting infrastructures like the classification societies, the towing people, the shipyards' capability to launch big structures into the sea, they are all present in Singapore.
So we should get started. It's almost like, you know, we're tailor-made, a tailor-made environment for that. So Soon Heng, you founded the Society of Floating Solutions, and you're looking to move, you know, from scientific principles to actual structures. How far along have we gone with that? And one thing I wanted to ask you specifically, are these floating structures sort of, can you move them around?
Well, all floating structures can be moved around because they are not attached to the seabed, right? So in terms of how far are we, well, we have already been building floating structures. We are building oil rigs, we are building FPSOs, and we are exporting them to you know, far corners of the world, right? So it's a matter of transferring that skill sets to a different area. And in this case, it's for building floating hotels, floating offices, floating factories, even floating refineries, desalination plants. The skill sets are there. It's only transferring that skill set to a different area.
That sounds really...
Would there be, I was just thinking, like, would there be an ideal sort of scenario where you would kick off these floating structures? I mean, should it be residential or commercial? I mean, is one easier than the other? Okay.
For a start, I wouldn't recommend residential floating structures in the sea, because for residential structures, I mean, people living in the sea need to have a social infrastructure to support them, you know, the schools and the hospitals and all those social infrastructure is necessary. But what you could do is to go to the industrial assets, like, for instance, power stations, shipyards, refineries. You could put them afloat and then repurpose the land that they're now occupying, right? And that land could be used for many things, like houses, factories, new technologies could be put to good use on the land that they vacate.
And with that kind of development, you would have to have water taxis as well. So
as well, water taxis
another booming industry
drone taxis. And,
yeah, lots of industries that will be created as a result of this.
Right.
So Soon Heng, thank you very much for coming in to give us a glimpse of what the future is probably going to look like. We've been speaking there with Mr. Lim Soon Heng. He is founder president of the Society of Floating Solutions.